This is our 5th annual budget breakfast briefing, and we're very delighted to welcome you to it at Roast. For the second year running, the spokesman will be John Willman, who's the business editor for the Financial Times. So please do welcome John. He's going to be talking for about 15 minutes or so, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So John, please do.
Thank you very much. Well, it may well tax me to speak for 15 minutes on such an empty budget, but I'll do my best. I must say I did like the headline on the Evening Standard last night. I'm sure you all saw it. It said, "Drinkers hammered." And I certainly felt like getting hammered after I'd heard the budget, because it seems that my binge drinking is going to be taxed much more heavily. It was really a budget with no theme, I felt, and you could see that from just first of all, that he said so little that was new, but secondly, there were so many little gimmicky things. A mention of plastic bags, for example, talk about energy costs, but no actual action. There's some green stuff, but it didn't seem like there was anything that would happen anytime soon. And I knew that the budget really had nothing very new to say when he announced a new initiative to help women entrepreneurs, which would cost the princely sum of £10 million over 3 years. And I suspect if I passed a hat around this room, we could probably raise a similar sum without too much difficulty. And yet, he used some of his valuable budget time for that. Now, the real problem for him was, he had two problems. The first was, there are some big tax cuts coming in April. We've all forgotten about these, I think, but income tax is going down from 22p in the pound to 20p, the basic rate, and they're abolishing the 10% rate. And the corporation tax rate for big companies is going down from 30 to 28%. But those were all announced last year by Gordon Brown, so he took all the credit for those. And poor old Alistair Darling had nothing new to say there. But his other problem was he's got no real room for manoeuvre. It's a very tough position he finds himself in. As we all know, and I'm sure you must be beginning to experience this already, there's great uncertainty about the business future. The economy is slowing down, and Alistair actually said that he was reducing his growth rate for the economy to 2% this year. His borrowing is going to have to be bigger next year because of that. When the economy slows down, the amount of money he gets in tax, particularly from companies, falls. So that gives him a problem. He's already committed to smaller increases in spending because they couldn't go on spending like they did for the first 10 years. So there's no more money to give away. And actually, I don't think he can really raise taxes in any very serious way, because there's an election sometime in the next 2 years, and raising taxes at this period is always a bad mistake if you want to get re-elected. So he's really rather locked in. He didn't have many options. On top of that, actually, because already things are slowing down, he's a bit short of money, so he had to raise a little bit of tax this year. He's put in a few tax increases, which we'll talk about in a minute, which will bring in overall about £2.9 billion by 2010. He's giving some of that back, and we'll talk about that as well, but it means net he's taking £1.8 billion out of the economy in the next couple of years. Now, this is not a good thing to be doing at this time. When the economy is slowing, the Treasury should be putting money. He has to do that is a sign of how few options he has left, because after 10 years in which Gordon Brown had a most wonderful economy that was growing and low inflation and no recessions, he never put anything away for a rainy day. So when the rainy day is arriving, as it may be now, he's got no scope to do anything creative. Okay, let's have a look at some of the measures. I mean, I suspect in this grouping here, many of you may have been hoping that there would be some announcement on capital gains tax. You'll remember that Alistair Darling at the pre-budget report in October announced what I think he thought was a very bright idea, and actually in some ways has a lot to commend it, which was simplifying capital gains tax. For those of you who've ever had to deal with a capital gains tax return will know it's a fiendishly complicated tax now. Lots of things have been bolted onto it. It's got more barnacles than the QE2 on it. It seems to me, it's more or less impossible for the average taxpayer to know what their tax bill is or to calculate their own bill. So what he decided to do was he would simplify the whole system. He'd get rid of all the barnacles, he'd get rid of all the multiple rates, and he'd have a single rate of 18%. Now 18% is not a bad rate. It's much lower than most other countries, and it's much lower than what you pay in income tax if you're a top-rate taxpayer. But the trouble was, 10 years ago, Gordon Brown gave some very generous tax concessions to entrepreneurs. And it basically meant that entrepreneurs could pay capital gains tax at 10%. And those entrepreneurs naturally were not very pleased to hear that their tax rate would rise from 10% to 18%, an 80% rise in their tax bill. And what made them even more angry was the people who were getting the lower tax rate were the people that you sort of think aren't quite as deserving. They're the people with second homes, people who've bought lots of buy-to-let property, and also the average investor with a portfolio of shares and unit trusts. They'll all see their tax rate fall. The entrepreneur who's put his livelihood on the line and risked everything to start a business and to give employment to other people sees his tax rate rise. So that was a real point of anger, I think, for many in business, and produced a huge outcry back in the autumn, which Alistair Darling addressed in January by saying he would introduce what he called entrepreneurs' relief, which would keep the rate at 10% for the first £1 million worth of gains for businesses. Now, that's a worthwhile concession, and it actually takes a lot of small businesses out of that capital gains tax net. But it doesn't really deal with the really serious entrepreneurs, the people who really are creating a big business, or the serial entrepreneur who over his life may start 2 or 3 businesses. And they certainly feel very angry about it, and we're hoping, I think, that there might be some backing down on that. But there isn't. There's no backing down. And of course, the other thing that was very obvious to everybody when it was announced in October was that it was actually a tax-raising exercise, this simplification, because it was going to bring in another £800 million a year. And of course, the people who'd be paying most of that £800 million would be the entrepreneurs. So I think there was some sadness yesterday in business that this wasn't reversed. The other big change that was announced in October, which caused a belated outcry, was the tax treatment of foreign residents in the UK, the people we call non-doms. They're not domiciled in the UK. And it has to be said that Britain has long had a very generous tax treatment for this group of people. I'm told it dates back to the Napoleonic Wars and the introduction of income tax. What it means is that if you count as non-dom, in other words, you're somebody who's not really British but happens to be living here, you pay tax in Britain on whatever you earn in Britain and your capital gains in Britain, but anything you earn outside Britain or any investments you have are not taxed in Britain. It's assumed they're taxed in the country where you have them. Now, if you were starting with a new tax system, you probably wouldn't introduce it that way, but we've had this system for about 200 years. I'm told it was introduced because it was a way of, when they introduced income tax, they didn't want all the slave owners in the foreign colonies seceding from Britain, so they said, well, we won't tax what you've got out in places like Jamaica, we'll only tax you if you come back to the UK. So it's not got a very respectable history, but it has meant that over the years, London has been a very attractive place for very wealthy people to come, and also for very talented people to come, particularly across the river in the City of London. It does mean that, and I'm sure those of you who have connections with the City of London will know just how diverse it is. I mean, the average investment bank, for example, 40% of the employees will be non-doms. And they're people who bring great diversity and knowledge to the City of London. It's one of the reasons why London has been so good at staying ahead of its competitors in devising new financial products like Islamic finance. In the City of London, there are lots of Muslim people working as investment bankers who have the expertise to introduce something like that. And these are people who find it attractive to be in London because of this non-dom tax treatment. Now, the trouble with that is it does look very unfair to lots of British people. You've got these extremely wealthy people living in London and around the country who aren't paying tax on their foreign income, not paying it in Britain anyway. And this has been a little bone of contention for many years. Gordon Brown did talk about abolishing this special treatment when he first became Chancellor, but every time he looked at it, he decided it wasn't worth doing, that there'd be losses as well as gains. But last autumn, at the Tory party conference, George Osborne wanted to unveil a cut in inheritance tax, and he thought he would show how he could pay for this by taxing the non-doms. And of course, Gordon Brown being a bit of a magpie and Alistair Darling, they grabbed the idea because they thought there was about to be an election. And they probably thought to themselves, we don't know the details, but we'll just do this, and then after the election we can look at it properly. But of course, the election never happened, and they'd made the promise, and they had to stick with it. And as time went by, it became more and more obvious that this was going to be a real problem for Britain, that lots of very wealthy and talented people were thinking about leaving the country because they felt angry about this. It first really came to notice, I think, with an interview which I did in the Financial Times with Digby Jones, who's now a government minister. And he's the guy who's in charge of bringing investment to Britain. And I taxed him on this. I asked him some questions. I don't think he was expecting it, but anyway, he always answers questions. He's a very good guy. And he said he thought it made it harder for him to sell Britain as a place to do business. And once he said that, and we put it in the FT, it then sort of opened the floodgates, and loads of people all over the place were saying, look, this is going to be very bad for Britain. City bankers. I was actually lobbied by a whole group of Asian entrepreneurs who include some names you would recognise that I unfortunately can't tell you, but really wealthy people who employ tens of thousands of people in this country who said they were so angry about it they were thinking of relocating. And if they did, obviously they'd be less interested in their businesses in this country. Now, obviously, there are some non-DOMs that I think we could quite happily see the back of. They're the people that you see driving around London in their Rolls Royces, and they probably don't pay much British tax. But a lot of business folk, a lot of entrepreneurs, and a lot of investors are here. They are non-DOMs, and we don't want to lose them. Well, yesterday, the nearest thing I've ever seen to a back-down came when Alistair Darling announced a whole list of concessions for the non-DOMs. The one thing that's staying is that if you want to go on being a non-DOM, in other words, not having your foreign income brought into the British tax net, after 7 years you'll have to pay £30,000 a year, and that will apply to each adult. But he ruled out lots of other things that were really worrying the non-DOMs. I mean, one thing he ruled out, for example, was it wouldn't apply to their children. Because again, I've had entrepreneurs approaching me saying, look, I've got me, my spouse, 3 children. Does that mean I have to pay 5 lots of £30,000? So it'll just be down to adults. He also introduced several other things which were worrying. One of the things was that if they bought a valuable painting into the country, that would actually count as bringing the money they'd spent on buying the painting into the country. So if you bought yourself a nice £1 million Van Gogh and bought it to this country and lent it to the National Gallery, you'd actually you'd be taxed as having bought £1 million into the country. So all these sort of little details he tidied up on. And short of actually abolishing the £30,000, I think most people will be moderately satisfied with that. And he also promised that there'd be no more changes in the taxation regime for non-DOMs for this Parliament, and he also promised for the next, though that's not something he can actually promise because there might be a different government on the next one. So there we go. Anyway, those were the 2 big headline ones we thought for business in today's FT. But there was a third element which I have to confess I haven't had a chance to study in detail, and nobody has. I think they've become very aware that the very good relationship that they'd built up over 10 years with the business community, New Labour and business, had been almost blown away by these foolish announcements they made last October. And I think they want to rebuild that relationship. I think they do realise it's important for a government to have a good relationship with business. And funnily enough, I think voters expect governments to have a good relationship with business. They think if business doesn't trust the government, can I trust them? So they've started to rebuild those relationships. And what they published yesterday was a big document about enterprise in Britain, a whole package of measures about things like skills and research and innovation and so on. But the one that really caught my eye was about red tape, which I'm sure is a subject of great interest to everybody here. Now, the government has every year announces some new initiative on red tape, so I'm moderately cynical about this. John Hutton said yesterday that they were really serious this time about cutting red tape. If I had £1 for every time I've heard a government minister say I'm really serious this time about cutting red tape, I'd have about £10. So, but what they're going to do is they say they'll try and give each government department a budget. It says basically this is the amount of red tape you're allowed to impose. So if you want to impose a new bit for some very good reason, you've got to take an old bit away. Whether that'll work, I don't know, but it does show that they're very keen to address this issue. Okay, those were the big business issues. let's just have a quick run around some of the other things that happened yesterday. I mean, the first big one, and this probably interests you more as personal consumers than as business folk, there was no energy package. There's been a lot of speculation, including in the FT over the last few weeks, that there was going to be some sort of windfall tax on the energy companies, which have made a lot of money in the last few years. And it would have been a nice populist measure because people are feeling that energy prices have got very high. When the reason they've got very high is actually because world energy prices are very high, but it's putting a lot of household budgets under strain, particularly with low-income groups. So the idea was perhaps to have a windfall tax and give some of the money back to poorer people. Well, there wasn't that. That wasn't there. All there was a rather limp promise that, or a rather limp urging that the energy companies should try and give more money to what they call vulnerable consumers and people on prepayment meters. There was also no real green taxes either, amazingly. I thought there would be some. There were lots of promises of green tax. There's going to be a new system of car taxing to try and persuade people not to drive gas guzzlers, but that's not coming into 2010. And then amazingly, he postponed the rise in fuel duty. Now, I'm sure we're all very grateful for that, because this £5 gallon that's looming over the horizon is a bit of a shocker. But on the other hand, if you're serious about wanting to reduce carbon emissions, putting up the price of fuel is a pretty good way of doing it. And that seemed like a bit odd for a government that says climate change is the most important issue facing the country. I did mention earlier that they're going to spend some money, and the one thing they're going to spend some money on is attacking child poverty. The government's committed to eliminating it by 2020, and that means getting rid of half of it by 2010. And they made good progress for the first 5 years of that programme, but it's rather slipped behind now. And I'm afraid, I think, although £1 billion is a very worthwhile sum, which is what they're going to put back into it, it certainly won't help them achieve their target quickly enough. But I think there's also a paper coming on how to get more people back into work, because most of the progress that has been made in reducing child poverty since New Labour came to power has been not actually giving benefits to poor families, but it's been getting them back into the world of work, which is the way to get people out of poverty in the long run. Okay, that's the package, and I'll happily answer any questions or issues you have afterwards. But just to sum it all up, it seems to me that, first of all, it was a very boring hour that we all had to sit through. Secondly, there's not very much came out of it. But the third and worrying thing is, I think there's quite a lot of risks here. The Chancellor is assuming that this current downturn in the economy will be very limited. He assumes that growth will be back to 3% by 2010. Now, I hope he's right, but I think that's a bit of a risky assumption. And certainly everybody involved in the city keeps saying there's more doom and gloom to come. And so that's one big risk. The second risk is he really does have no leeway. As I said, instead of putting away money for a rainy day, they've spent the money as fast as they could get it for the last 10 years. And while they make a lot about their golden rule and not borrowing more than 40% of GDP, government borrowing shouldn't be more than 40% of GDP overall, they're going to get to 39.8% in 2010. And that's very, very close to that level, and really is no leeway at all in case things go a bit wrong. So I think the Chancellor's got a very difficult few years ahead of him, and it's not clear to me that he won't have to, at some stage, either put up taxes or cut spending in order to avoid a bigger crisis. So to sum up, I think what you would say is we've had 10 years of Gordon Brown's prudence. We've been through one of the most biggest expansions in the economy in history of Gordon Brown always says 10 years of uninterrupted growth, but actually it's 15 years because it began in 1992. And there's been low inflation, strong growth. There hasn't been a single quarter when the British economy hasn't grown. That's probably the best it's ever going to be. And we haven't made the preparations for the bad times. So, to sum up, I think the cupboard is bare, and that was revealed by the absolute lack of any really new initiatives yesterday, which may be a blessing for us all, because new initiatives tend to go wrong. But that's it. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sue Hill. Oh, that is loud. I'm Sue Hill from a small local business. It is my understanding that the economy has been really, really good since 1992, and that we are very fortunate in this country to be in a very strong position despite what we read or hear. I have been led to believe that it would take an awful lot of damage by government or the press or whoever to tilt the kilter. What would you say about that? Do you believe that we can survive on going forward on whatever, 92 to 2008, it's 16 years of sustained growth? There's a lot of money in the economy, there's a strong service industry, and there's growth around the world as well that should reflect well on the UK.
I have to say, I'm an optimist on this, fun enough, which is odd for a journalist, because if you read the newspapers, there's nothing, including our own one, the outlook looks fairly gloomy. My job as business editor is actually to talk to business people a lot in the UK. And just before Christmas, I was asked to do a big analysis piece, and the commission was, look, the economy is slowing down. Presumably all these businesses that you talk to are laying off people or having recruitment freezes or shelving their investment plans or whatever, you know, not refurbishing their buildings. Could you phone around and find out what's going on? And I phoned around everybody I knew, and I couldn't find a single business that would say they were doing any of those things. In fact, the complaint in December was they still couldn't get enough good people to do all the work they had. Now, there's a couple of sectors where that's not true. One is commercial property. Another's residential property. The builders are having a slightly hard time because there's a bit of a pause in the market. And then, of course, over in financial services, where everybody is taking huge write-offs for the bad debts they've incurred. But the really funny thing about financial services is, as far as I can see, not many people have lost their jobs yet. In fact, I was talking to somebody who worked at Merrill Lynch, and they said in London, and this is a company that, I'm not going to remember the right figures, but it's written off many billions of bad loans, and it's had to raise more capital from Middle Eastern investors. They said in London they'd lost less than 50 people in the last 3 months, which they would lose normally anyway, I guess. That their bonus levels were 80 to 90% of last year's levels. The only slight snag was the share price had halved. So the truth is, it's better to work for an investment bank than invest in one, I think. So I don't see yet much evidence of a downturn for British business. And I think there's some quite strong aspects of it. Like you, I agree with that. One of the interesting areas I write about is manufacturing. Now, I won't bother to do this exercise, but if we went around the table and said, what do you think about manufacturing? You'd probably say it's dying on its feet, you know, it's an old-fashioned, nobody does it anymore. Actually, Britain is the 6th biggest manufacturing country in the world. And I also visit manufacturing companies, and I'm just amazed at how well they're doing. We had a huge shakeout over 20 years, but that shakeout got rid of all the old industries, the things that are better done in China and India. And the people who are left now are really quite resilient. And they also make things that people have to have. I mean, I'm amazed at how many of them, for example, make important components for the oil and gas industry. And they're not even particularly price sensitive, because if you're going to build a pipeline over the Siberia, you don't want to put in a cheap tap. You've got to put in the best, because you're going to get fired if it goes wrong. So we have all these people doing all these very high-tech things. And you've probably noticed, actually, if you think about it, 10 years ago, every time interest rates went up or the exchange rate rose, you'd have manufacturers complaining, saying we're not competitive anymore. Well, actually, just think, you probably haven't heard a manufacturer complaining about those things for quite a long time. They're not that bothered. They're doing very well. They've often shifted some of the low-grade stuff out to emerging markets, but they've got really good products that they're selling all over the world. So that bit's very strong. You mentioned services, that's also very strong. But the one niggling thing I have at the back of my head is senior bankers you talk to say they think this is the worst banking crisis they've seen in their generation. And you sort of feel there has to be some fallout from that. If banks stop lending, for example, to good businesses, that makes it hard for businesses to expand and develop. My own bet, if I had to put money on it, is that we won't have a recession in this country. We won't go into negative, the economy won't shrink. But what's not clear to me is it might not rebound quite as quickly as Alistair Darling's hoping for. So if supposing you had growth at 2 or 1.5% for a few years, that would all be fine. But it would mean that the Chancellor wouldn't get as much tax revenue in, and therefore you'd have to think of other ways of raising revenue if he wants to go on spending at the same rate. So I think that's the danger, really, not of an all-out recession. Incidentally, also, our people in America, by and large, don't think America is necessarily going into a recession. Although there's terrible gloom over there. Everybody in America thinks they're in recession already. But again, if you get outside the finance and the construction side, American businesses seem to be doing fine as well, and they're not laying people off, and they're not shelving investment plans. So, obviously, you can overdo the doom, but actually I think we are in for a rockier period ahead, not the lovely time we've had for the last 15, 16 years.
Well, I've got a small service industry, and a small service business, not industry, and based on what you've said, what I have done is taken on an extra floor in the building, negotiated a good deal because they were desperate, got builders queuing up to come and do the work, and pricing them down as hard as I can. I've increased my staff by 25%, and I've had the best February and March I've ever had. So I'll either be sitting here next year crying, or sitting here next year thinking, great, I didn't let it frighten me.
Yeah. Well, actually, my son is in the same business as you, and every night when he comes home, recruitment, every night when he comes home I say, how was it today, how was it today? Because it's a great leading indicator in recruitment. He gets so bored of it, he says, stop it, we've still not got enough people to fill the jobs we're trying to fill. So.
I'm Charlotte, I work for a company called Metro. I want to know what the media can do to stop things getting bad, or what they can do to calm things down, if they can.
That's a good question. I think all journalists look for bad news, that's certainly true, because bad news, people don't really want to hear good news. If we fill the newspaper with sort of if our front page story was manufacturing doing brilliantly, it would read just a bit like Pravda or something, we've overfulfilled our norms this month. I do think there's a danger that you can undermine confidence to some degree by negative comment, but I don't think in the long run the media have the power to create a crisis. They amplify what happens, they don't create it. And actually the interesting thing is, having gone through a period in which everybody was, a lot of the newspapers were full of doom and gloom, I think it's slightly eased now because nothing has happened yet. There haven't been layoffs, there haven't been closures. The other thing that I think makes everybody very cautious is, and I think this is true in business as well as in the media, is that nobody ever gets penalised for being too gloomy, but you can get penalised for being too optimistic. I always think this when I see the weather forecast. I don't know if you've noticed this, the weather's always much better than the weather forecast says it's going to be. And I always think of poor old Michael Fish on the day of the hurricane. Because if you as a weather forecaster say the weather's going to be good and you have a hurricane, then everybody attacks you and you're made a fool of. But if you say there's going to be a hurricane and it turns out not to be quite as bad as we thought it was, as it did this week, nobody says those weathermen, they're really stupid. They just say thank goodness for that. The same is true with giving bad news or good news. I was also talking to an accountant recently who said that this is the year end, as people like you will all know. You're probably doing your accounts about now, and you might, if you actually have to write a company report, you have to say what you think has happened over the last year and what you expect the outlook to be. Now, this accountant said to me that most of her clients knew that their businesses were doing really well at the moment. Really motoring, had a really good year, still doing very well, the order book's full. But there's this little section on the annual report which is called Outlook. And they're finding that very difficult to fill in. Because all their advisors, all their bankers are telling them that life is getting worse, but they can't see it in their own businesses. And if you're a listed company, and you say everything's fine, and then 3 months later you have to say, well, actually, the orders have turned down a bit. Your share price gets really punished at the moment. You know, companies that do this sort of thing find their share price can go down 25% in a day. So they're very nervous about filling that in. And probably some of them are therefore being a little more gloomy than they would naturally feel inclined to be, because it's a form of insurance. Whether there will be, or how extended the downturn will be, is just completely impossible to say. I mean, if I could say, I wouldn't be a journalist, I'd be going out and investing. But it seems to me that you always in life should hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And I think newspapers do their contribution in trying to make that happen. So I accept the blame that we sometimes are more gloomy than we should be.
Can we change the subject slightly to more international matters? What are your thoughts about the influence of sovereign wealth funds on UK businesses?
Have you got an investor who's a sovereign wealth fund?
Not yet, unfortunately.
I've got a few addresses if you need them. I'm one of those people who's hugely optimistic about sovereign wealth funds. I think it's rather wonderful, actually, because there is a redistribution of economic power in the world at the moment. We all feel it every day, really. The economic centre of gravity has shifted away from Europe and North America, and it's now somewhere hovering between those two markets and the Far East, of course, because you've got China resurgent, Korea, India, Vietnam. All these countries are really coming up fast, lots of economic strength. The trouble is they're sort of sitting on their savings a bit, and I think it's really good that they're forming these sovereign wealth funds to invest their surpluses. And instead of investing them in government stock, which is what they've done for years and years, buying American Treasury bonds, they've suddenly thought, which don't perform very well, to be honest. They're not brilliant investments. They're part of a portfolio, but you want a bit of exposure to growth companies. And I think the fact they've decided to invest in proper businesses is very good. It's also come at a very good time when all the banks are desperate for capital. They've got all these Middle Eastern and Far Eastern sovereign wealth funds who want to invest in them. Now, it caused a bit of a stir when this first came to notice, because it was seen as sort of like the Chinese were going to buy everything, or the Russians were going to buy our defence companies, or something like that. And all the fuss that happened at the beginning, I think, has led to people to think, what's the best way of handling this? So most of these sovereign wealth funds don't take very big stakes anymore. They keep their stakes under 10%, which means, you know, it doesn't trigger all sorts of things that they might have otherwise to do. They don't tend to demand a place on the board, and actually, from a management's point of view, they can be very good investors, because they're really quite passive. They're not activist investors. Now, whether that's a good thing is another matter. I think, you know, some companies need more activist investors because they need waking up. But if you take Citibank, for example, which was once the world's largest bank, I don't think it is anymore. It's had this guy, Prince Al-Walid, who's been an investor since 1991. And they really love him because he's supportive, he's put money in, he's put more in recently, and he doesn't rock the boat. So I don't think the sovereign wealth funds are necessarily a threat. Of course, there are certain bits of the economy you don't really want people who might in future be your opponents owning, of which defence companies is one. And the funny thing about that is the EADS, the European armaments maker, aeroplane maker, actually has a stake, a 5% stake held by a Russian bank. So that does seem a bit weird to me that, you know, when we're shaping up for more sparring with Russia, that we should allow the Russians to take a stake in a leading defence company. But there's all sorts of mechanisms for stopping that happening. And for Britain's point of view, I think there's a great plus here, is if we can welcome the sovereign wealth funds to London and say, well, you know, unlike the Americans, unlike the Germans, we welcome you. Why don't you come and set up your operations here and, you know, put all your transactions through London? And there's some evidence that's happening. So I think it's a good development.
What's your opinion on the handling of Northern Rock?
Now, that's one area it would be very hard to say something positive, isn't it? What a debacle. I don't follow that thing closely enough to know exactly what should have been done, but it does seem to me, as, and probably knowing scarcely more than anybody else in the room about this issue, that for the want of a little bit of support back last summer, London had the most embarrassing run on a bank, and one of the most high-profile casualties of the credit crunch, which would have done it no good as a financial centre. I think that's a great shame. The only comfort is that the credit crunches produce bad results in every country. You think, where did it start? It started on Wall Street with the subprime mortgages. The first banks to go down actually were German banks. You've had Société Générale, shows that the French regulatory system's not too good. So if you want to be positive about this, it turns out everybody's got shortcomings. But my own personal feeling was Northern Rock was a bank run that never needed happened. Having said that, its model was very risky. And I did once report on banking, and I remember meeting Adam Applegarth, the chief executive, or the former chief executive of Northern Rock, just after he'd come into office, and I'd just become banking editor. And he said, he took me out to lunch, and he couldn't stop talking about this wonderful new business model they had. This is the way forward. Borrow the money on the wholesale markets, don't bother about small savers. It was the way forward, and they'd had terrific success with it. And I sort of slightly recall that lunch when they had to announce that when the markets dried up, they lost their liquidity. I think in the long run it would be okay for London, but it was very embarrassing, and I've talked to lots of people around the world who said they were really shocked at seeing the television pictures of people queuing around the block to withdraw their savings. And it's certainly not something we've seen in Britain for well over 100 years. It's the sort of thing that we always imagine happens in other countries, like Latin American countries or wherever. So I think it's been a bad blow to morale. It was a temporary blow to London's reputation, but I think providing we can sort it out, it won't be a long-lasting one. And actually, the funny thing about it is the government rescue may actually turn out to be more successful than we suspect. There are a few people in this room who are old enough to remember the secondary banking crisis of the 1970s, when the government put out what it was called the lifeboat, which scooped up all the banks that were failing to stop it having runs and stop problems in the markets. And it took them about 20 years to work it out, but in the end it made a small profit. It sold on all the stuff and made a small profit. And I think there's a good chance that the taxpayer won't be out of pocket as a result of Northern Rock.
Thank you. Thank you, John. I think we're all hoping that a boring budget, the trade-off of that is not going to be a rollercoaster year for our businesses. So fingers crossed. Thanks very much. And on behalf of Better Bankside Business Club and everyone in the room today, thank you for digesting the budget so quickly and helping us to understand how it's going to impact our business lives. So a small token of our thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for attending this morning. If you are interested in viewing the event again, it's going to be available on Better Bankside's website as a podcast. We're all very technologically minded here, which is good news. So thank you once again for coming, and we hope to see you at our next events.